scripts that would not fit neatly in reviews. I had not chosen an easy path. I had chosen a true one. When I went to the kitchen to make tea, I found a note on the table in Lena's hurried scrawl. If I go to school, will you come see my first show? I will paint the sounds for you. I set the kettle on, and for the first time in a long while, I let my hands move in ordinary competence. The decision had been made, the course charted, but the consequences how Leni would fare under instruction, whether my modest concerts would cover the rent, whether I would find, in the patient accumulation of small work, a new way to be whole remained unresolved. That oversight was both terrifying and necessary. It meant I had not closed the book. It meant there would be pages yet to write. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. Outside, a tram passed, and the sound of its bell fell into the morning like punctuation. I left the flat with Clara at my side, and Lena's small painting tucked under my arm. There was, between the three of us, a brittle but growing conviction that the life I was choosing would be built of discreet, careful acts lessons, paintings, restrained performances, acts that might not console an audience hungry for spectacle but that could, perhaps, sustain those of us who lived inside them. It would not be a return in the old sense. It would be, instead, a reprieve and an ongoing reckoning. The world beyond the flat would carry on making demands. I had merely decided which ones I would accept. The ledger was open, and I had begun to write in a hand steadier than I'd expected. The next line, I thought as we walked down the stairwell, would have to be kept deliberately small. I had, at times in the months since the accident, imagined an ending as neat as a bow on a score, a single evening in which a miracle reclaimed what had been lost. Applause like a curtain, the world resettled in its old places. I had pictured a return that would erase the ledger of shame and replace it with the tidy arithmetic of success. Reality obliged me with something less teleological and, I now think, wiser. Not restoration but composition, the act of making a piece whose architecture is built around absence rather than denial. The piece I presented at the gallery was brief by design. It would have been faintly comic to produce something long and ambitious. That would have invited comparison in the very language I wanted to avoid. Instead, I took the modest rote, a single movement, approximately 10 minutes, spare in its ornament, marked with small, exacting breaths. The score occupied a single folio. The title was nothing theatrical, simply for Elle, which is to say for Leni, who had given me, in paint and presence, new points of reference. Preparation was less a frantic resurgence than a series of adjustments. My days had come to be measured in small mercies, a practice routine that accepted longer rests, a ritual of placing canvases beside the score, a constricted but earnest rehearsal of silence. Leni continued to paint. Her canvases multiplied like a private chorus behind me. She would stretch color in washes, and then interrupt them with a decisive mark, a slash of rusty red for a nervous accent, a thin line for the quick inversion of a motif. The paintings did not offer literal translation. They were not keys to a lost code. They offered suggestion and an emotional topology, a map of contours I was impoverished to recover from hearing alone. We spent one afternoon in the gallery before the event, arranging works and testing distances. The space was small and white-walled, the lighting indifferent in the way of spaces that do not pretend to spectacle. I sat at the piano and placed 3 of Lena's canvases behind me, a wide blue, a striated gray, and a narrow, rusty red that hummed in the corner like a small accusation. I felt, absurdly, as if I were setting place cards for invisible guests. The piano bench creaked beneath me. I placed the folio open across the fall board and laid a taped fragment of Lena's smallest painting against the score, a domestic absurdity that felt exactly right. Her bomb arrived early, leaning on a stick that had known the weight of many rehearsals. He had come with a packet of handwritten corrections tucked into his coat, not measures of music, but notes on the ethics of returning to stage, on the necessity of humility. "We have always played with what we had," he said, his voice small but fierce. Clara came after, moving through the room with the same practical tenderness she had always shown, a thermos of tea, a folded scarf, an economy of touch. Marta, of course, was there, discreetly calculating the guest list and offering anxieties as if they were commodities. Sophia and a handful of younger musicians sat at the back. Leni arrived last, her hands still stained, her braid askew. She paused before the canvases as if to say good evening to them. We had agreed on the modesty of the program. I would play my new fragment and then a handful of shorter, familiar pieces, not to parade virtuosity, but to set a conversational frame. The audience, such as it was a carefully chosen constellation: old colleagues, a few critics who had been reasonably fair, specific friends, and small patrons. It felt, as planned, like an invitation rather than a spectacle. I remember the first bar with a clarity that surprises me. The moment I lifted my hands, there was a small, reasonable terror, not the cabalistic fear of losing everything, but the particular anxiety of failing to be honest. The fingers moved. The sound unrolled. There were places where the phrasing stuttered, small gaps where my old internal map offered no counsel. In those measures I learned to rely on something else: an attentiveness to silence, to the tactile feedback of ebony and ivory, to the way Lena's distant canvas seemed to answer a phrase. It is ridiculous, perhaps, to describe the paintings as participants. They were not. They offered echoes, a field of visual suggestion that made forms more legible to me. When a phrase lost its way, the color behind me held a suggestion of its intended arc, and I would choose the next note with that visual cue in mind. It was not a miracle. It was an act of translation. There were moments of failure. During the second section, a passage I had once played almost without thinking, my hands separated in rhythm. For an instant the room filled with the tidy, clinical sound of timestamps, metronomic correctness without the breathe of feeling. I felt the old shame rise, familiar as a cough. I stopped, looked down at the page, and did something I had never done in performance. I spoke, quietly and without theatricality. "Excuse me," I said, and then I began again, the second attempt more considered, more susceptible to the painting's insinuations. The audience shifted. A woman near the front made a small sound, neither laughter nor reproach, but something like a recognition that work was underway. When the piece ended not with a theatrical flourish, but with a quiet decrescendo into a single tremulous chord, the gallery contained a peculiar silence. It was not the same as the old exhausted silence of an absent synesthesia, the blankness that had once made music into an unsatisfying ledger. It was a listening silence, attentive and somewhat puzzled. The applause was measured, no one lipped. People stood because they had been invited to stand, and because some inner economy had been altered. Marta, always quick to find a market angle, took in the room like a financier assessing an asset. Her Baum folded his hands and did not move. Clara, who had sat with a cup that had gone cold between her knees, came forward and touched my shoulder with something that was not triumph but approval. Afterward the foyer felt compact and oddly tender. Conversations happened in low voices. People who had once known me as an exemplar of facility now spoke as if to a colleague who had returned with a different language. A man I did not recognize, he was neither a critic nor a patron. Simply an attentive listener, told me he had felt colors at a certain bar and could not explain why. "That blew at the exposition," he said, using Lena's word. "It held the long note. It made the gap make sense." I wanted to tell him he was inventing, that the mind had a way of retrofitting meaning. Instead I nodded and said simply, "Thank you." The days that followed were predictably ambivalent. Felix Jern wrote his piece, as I had half expected, not savage, but hungry for narrative. He framed the evening as an experiment, a fragment of redemption, and in doing so he offered the public the template it prefers: fall, then dramatic recovery. Marta called with offers that shimmered with potential. One was a televised event promising wide reach and lucrative arrangements. Another was a festival that would place me back in an older circuit, where my name still had purchase. I answered in the only way that felt coherent to me. I declined the large spectacle. Marta did not like it. "You could have one night," she said, practical and sharp. "One night where they have to see you as yourself again." She may be right. In another life, I might have succumbed to the arithmetic of one night. but the arithmetic of one night is always ruinous when it is bought at the price of truth. I am a craftsman of sound. I am also, I discovered, fragile. To risk a miracle for the sake of a headline would be to invite the ledger to reopen. I told Marta as much and signed the polite refusals with hands that trembled a little. Clara read my decision without surprise. She said simply, "We will make smaller offers. We will teach. We will make." She had, in the months since the accident, been a steady presence in ways that are more difficult to enumerate than to feel. She kept the household. She argued gently with me when I suggested plans that were unlikely. She offered the sort of small comforts that do not advertise themselves: a cup of tea left by the piano, a dish of something the indifferent Vienna winter made delicious because it was warm. Her steadiness made me nearer to life than my own will often does. Her balm and I repaired our distance in slow, careful conversations. He spoke not of reputation but of craft. "Technique is a servant," he told me one autumn morning as if reciting something from his own syllabus of life. "It must be held accountable to the phrase." I heard, in that bluntness, no condescension but a certain kind of permission, the permission to make work that was less about display than about necessity. Sophia visited my flat more often. I taught her lessons that were short and exacting. Teaching, I found, quieted a certain noise in my head. In giving language to what I knew form, tension, a release, I realized my teaching had become part of the life I chose. Leanie faced a different decision. Her art was getting noticed in small circles. An art school offered her a place. It would have been a concession of a sort, structure in place of improvisation. "Anja," her mother, spoke to me frankly about prospects. "She needs a future," Anja said. "Paint doesn't always pay." Leanie listened and then, with that bluntness children possess, told us both that she would consider it, but would not allow instruction to hollow out her directness. It was a negotiation, not a capitulation. In the end, we arranged that she could take an occasional course at the school while continuing to paint in the market. I promised to be there if she wanted to keep painting by my side during rehearsals. She promised to sign the canvases I asked her to, but only if she could paint what she liked. It is perhaps obvious to say that loss teaches us to choose. The more difficult admission is that the choices are always partly accidents of small economies, the availability of space, a friendly critic, the willingness of a teacher to grant patience. I chose, with a clarity that surprised me, to accept a new economy of art. I would play smaller halls, take on students, and collaborate with other makers, painters, writers, instrument makers, rather than pursuing one exceptional night that would reassert the old hierarchy of spectacle. It was a practical decision and an ethical one. I preferred a life in which music was conversation rather than a platform for proving that I had, indeed, not been diminished. There were practical consequences. Offers arrived that I, slowly and with a renewed sense of what I might reasonably supply, negotiated. Marta found a modest series of salon concerts that fit the new scale. A small publisher suggested printing the short piece for Lel, in a limited run. Felix moved on to other narratives. Some critics applauded the honesty of the gallery night. Others wrote about novelty. The public appetite for spectacle did not flatter me when it addressed me. I had neither the appetite to feed it nor the temperament to pretend I could. When a festival offered a slot that would have required me to perform the standard repertoire in a large hall, I declined. The decision felt less like renunciation and more like fidelity to the work I had made. The final pages of my own ledger are less dramatic than earlier episodes in my life. I continue to teach. Sophia's progress is a small solace. She asks precise questions and listens in a way that demands clarity. Her balm visits, and our conversations wander from phrasing to the memory of an absent father and back again. Clara and I have found a rhythm in which affection and practicality coexist. We are not newly married to one another, but renewed friends who keep a household where art and domesticity are permitted a mutual respect. Leanie paints and sells pieces in the market. Sometimes she brings a canvas and we place it behind my score as an experiment. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it does not. Both outcomes are instructive. The manuscript ends, if one can speak of an ending, with a simple act. One evening, after I had written the last bar of For L, and the ink had dried, I sat at my upright in the flat. The winter rain made an even sound on the sill. I placed a blank folio on the stand, the same cheap staff paper I had used for exercises in the conservatory. I took up a pencil and hesitated. For much of my life the act of writing music was accompanied by color in my head. The synesthesia had been a private synod, a map one could trust. Now, before me there was only the white of the page and the thin graphite line. I drew the first bar a simple interval, measured and deliberate. It was an admission as much as a composition. When I set the pencil down the room seemed to breathe. From the corner of my eye Lena's small canvas rested against the radiator. It was an uncertain blue, the kind she often used for low notes. I let my gaze fall upon it, and for a moment a thin, private thing I fancied I saw a tint at the edge of the blue that I had not noticed before. Whether it was fatigue, wishful perception, or the first during some slow reconfiguration I cannot say. I am careful, now, of grand pronouncements. I will not claim recovery. But there is a modestness to the music I make now that seems truer. It asks of listeners what it asked of me: patience, attention, the willingness to accompany absence rather than to deny it. I close this ledger with no certainties save one: art, when it is honest, does not pretend to be whole. It offers what it can hold and asks the world to accept the rest. I have learned that to compose is sometimes to write the architecture for a gap, and to invite others to bridge it with their own perception. There is work to be done, and I intend to do it. The next morning I will take Sophia through a set of exercises. Leanie will perhaps bring another painting. Clara will make tea. The radiator will clink. The city will continue, indifferent as ever, and within its indifference we will make our quiet refusals and our fragile offers. There is a hook, because life requires them. The last time I thought I had nothing left to give, a child with paint-stained palms drew for me a map I could follow. I do not know whether there will come a day when the colors return in the way they once did. I suspect they will not, and I am learning to accept that. What is possible now is more complicated and, in ways that terrify me less, more honest. I put my name to the folio, I sign the small score, and I place the result in the drawer with the other modest things I have learned to cherish. The door clicks. The house settles. Somewhere in the building a heater hums. I rise with the feeling, thin as a veil, that the next phrase is not lost but merely waiting for a patient hand to find it.